2 weeks ago, the coalition supporting United States military operations against Iran consisted of 12 nations. Ships from the United Kingdom patrolled the Persian Gulf alongside American destroyers. French strike aircraft flew missions from bases in the United Arab Emirates. German intelligence agencies shared satellite imagery and signals intercepts. Smaller contributions came from Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, Australia, and several Gulf states. It was not a large coalition by historical standards, but it provided legitimacy, shared burden, and diplomatic cover for what was increasingly becoming a protracted conflict. Today, that coalition has collapsed to 3 participants: the United States, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates. And the circumstances of the collapse reveal fractures in the transatlantic alliance that will take years, perhaps decades, to repair. The catalyst was the president's televised address threatening to erase an entire civilization. The nuclear football opened on camera. The activation of DEFCON 2, the scrambling of B-2 bombers carrying nuclear payloads. For 6 hours, the world believed that the United States might actually launch a nuclear strike against Iran. And when morning came without mushroom clouds, the relief was immediate, but the damage was lasting. Allied governments had not been consulted. There were no advance warnings through diplomatic channels, no coordination with NATO headquarters. The decision to threaten nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state was made unilaterally by the American president and communicated to the world via television. Allies learned about it the same way everyone else did, by watching the news. In London, the response was swift. The British Parliament, which had reluctantly authorized limited support for operations against Iran based on assurances that the conflict would remain conventional and proportional, convened an emergency session. Members from across the political spectrum expressed outrage. The opposition Labour Party called for immediate withdrawal of British forces. Conservative backbenchers, normally supportive of the Transatlantic alliance, questioned whether the special relationship extended to complicity in what they characterized as potential genocide. The debate lasted 4 hours. The arguments were emotional and substantive. Members referenced the Nuremberg principles, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the moral foundations of British foreign policy. The vote, when it came, was decisive. 340 members voted for withdrawal. 180 voted to maintain the deployment. The margin was larger than most observers had anticipated. Within 24 hours, orders were transmitted to HMS Diamond and HMS Defender, 2 Type 45 destroyers operating in the Gulf. The ships were to disengage from coalition operations, complete their current patrol routes, and return to Portsmouth. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just a quiet withdrawal of forces that had been operating alongside American vessels for 6 months. The official statement from the Ministry of Defense was diplomatic in tone but unambiguous in message. The United Kingdom remained committed to the Transatlantic alliance and to cooperative security arrangements with the United States. But British forces would not participate in operations where the potential use of nuclear weapons had been explicitly threatened without consultation and without parliamentary authorization. The decision was framed as adherence to constitutional principles, not as a repudiation of the alliance. But the effect was the same. France followed within 3 days. President Macron had attempted quiet diplomacy first, calling the White House to express concern and request clarification on nuclear doctrine and decision-making processes. The call, according to sources familiar with it, did not go well. Macron was told that the president had full authority as commander-in-chief to make decisions regarding nuclear weapons, and that consultation with allies, while valued, was not required. Macron consulted with his own defense and foreign policy advisors. The consensus was clear. France had been a nuclear power since 1960 and had developed its own doctrine around nuclear deterrence. That doctrine explicitly limited nuclear use to existential threats to French national survival. It did not permit preemptive nuclear strikes against non-nuclear states, and it required that any contemplation of nuclear use involve extensive deliberation and multiple layers of authorization. The idea that a single individual could threaten nuclear annihilation in a televised address, without prior consultation with military leadership or allied governments, was fundamentally incompatible with French strategic culture. Macron made the decision. 12 Rafale fighter jets stationed at Dhafra Air Base in the UAE were recalled to France. The pilots flew their final missions, landed, and within 48 hours, the aircraft were being disassembled and loaded onto transport planes for the flight home. Macron's public statement was more pointed than the British version. He noted that France had stood with allies in Afghanistan, in Mali, in the fight against ISIS. But France would not be complicit in actions that violated international norms it had helped establish. The reference to international norms was deliberate. France had been a driving force behind the development of humanitarian law and had consistently argued that nuclear weapons, if they were to exist at all, must be subject to the most stringent constraints on use. Germany's response was different in form but aligned in substance. Germany had not contributed combat forces to the operation. Constitutional and political constraints limited the deployment of German military forces outside of NATO territory except under specific circumstances, and those circumstances did not include offensive operations against Iran. But Germany had been providing intelligence support, satellite imagery from German reconnaissance satellites, signals intelligence collected by German agencies, analysis and assessments shared through NATO channels. That support ended. The German foreign minister announced that intelligence sharing related to operations against Iran would be suspended pending a comprehensive review of the strategic objectives and legal framework of the conflict. The language was bureaucratic, but the message was clear. Germany would not contribute to a campaign where nuclear use had been threatened. The decision was driven partly by domestic politics. The Green Party, a member of the governing coalition, had long opposed nuclear weapons and had made their position a condition of continued coalition support. But it also reflected broader German strategic thinking. Germany had worked for decades to build a rules-based international order where conflicts were resolved through diplomacy and where the use of force, when necessary, was proportional and lawful. The casual threat of nuclear annihilation violated every principle that framework was built on. Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands, whose contributions had been modest to begin with, followed similar patterns. Quietly and without dramatic announcements, they ended their participation. Liaison officers were recalled. Intelligence sharing stopped. Offers of logistical support were withdrawn. None of these nations had been central to the military effort, but their participation had provided a sense of international legitimacy. Their departure reinforced the image of an increasingly isolated United States. Australia presented a partial exception. The Australian government did not withdraw its support entirely. Intelligence cooperation continued, and logistical assistance remained available. But Australian officials made clear that their continued participation was contingent on the conflict remaining conventional. Any actual use of nuclear weapons would result in immediate and total withdrawal of all Australian support. The message was a warning as much as a policy statement. The Gulf states were in a more complicated position. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar hosted American military bases and had tacitly supported operations against Iran. But they also lived in proximity to Iran and understood that any escalation, particularly nuclear escalation, could result in devastating retaliation against them. Their response was to maintain a careful neutrality. The bases remained open, but active cooperation ceased. They would not obstruct American operations, but neither would they enable them beyond providing access to facilities that had been leased under long-standing agreements. The collapse of the coalition had immediate operational impacts. The withdrawal of British destroyers reduced naval presence in the Gulf. French strike aircraft had been conducting missions that now fell entirely to American pilots, increasing sortie rates and pilot fatigue. German intelligence had provided coverage of areas that American satellites did not monitor continuously. Those gaps now existed, but the strategic impact was far greater than the operational. The United States had assembled coalitions for military operations for decades. The model was well established. America provided the bulk of the forces and capabilities. Allies contributed what they could, shared the burden, and provided political legitimacy for the operation. The coalition structure signaled that the United States was not acting alone, that its actions had international support, and that the mission served broader interests than narrow American objectives. That model had collapsed. The coalition of 12 had become a coalition of 3: the United States, Israel, and the UAE. Israel's participation was driven by its own security concerns regarding Iran. The UAE's participation was shaped by geographic proximity and complex regional dynamics. Neither represented broad international support for American policy. They represented nations with their own reasons for opposing Iran, reasons that were independent of and in some cases divergent from American strategic objectives. The diplomatic damage extended beyond the immediate question of Iran. The Transatlantic alliance, already strained by years of disagreement on trade, climate policy, and burden sharing, had suffered a blow that called into question the fundamental premises of cooperation. If the United States could threaten nuclear war without consulting allies, what did the alliance mean? If American decision-making could be so erratic and unilateral, how could allies plan their own security policies around the assumption of American reliability? European officials, speaking privately, expressed a consistent theme. Trust had been broken. Not trust in American military capability, that remained unquestioned, but trust in American judgment, in American restraint, and in American willingness to operate within the frameworks of international law and alliance coordination. Those were the foundations on which the alliance had been built, and those foundations had cracked. NATO itself faced an internal crisis. The alliance's charter did not require members to support every American military operation, but the expectation of consultation and coordination was embedded in decades of practice. The failure to consult on a decision as consequential as nuclear threats undermined that practice. Officials within NATO headquarters began to question whether procedures needed to be formalized. Should there be explicit guidelines requiring consultation before major military decisions? Should allies have the ability to collectively restrain unilateral actions by individual members? Those conversations were preliminary and contentious, but they reflected a deeper concern. The alliance as currently structured might not be sustainable if one member could take actions that placed all members at risk without prior agreement. Public opinion in allied nations overwhelmingly supported withdrawal. Polls in Germany showed 81% approval for suspending intelligence cooperation. In France, 76% supported the recall of aircraft. In the United Kingdom, 73% favored bringing the destroyers home. The numbers reflected broad public discomfort with the trajectory of the conflict and specific opposition to nuclear threats. The political consequences for leaders who maintained support would have been severe. Macron, facing domestic challenges, could not afford to be seen as complicit in actions his electorate opposed. British Prime Minister faced backbench revolt and opposition attacks. German Chancellor led a coalition that would have fractured if support continued. The domestic political calculus made withdrawal not just morally defensible but politically necessary. The United States found itself in a position it had not experienced since the early stages of the Iraq War in 2003. Diplomatically isolated, operating without the legitimacy that comes from broad international support, facing questions about the wisdom and legality of its actions, and learning once again that military power alone does not translate into strategic success when allies withdraw their support and global opinion turns hostile. The coalition had collapsed, and rebuilding it, if that was even possible, would require addressing the fundamental question that had driven allies away. Could the United States be trusted to exercise its power with restraint, in consultation with allies, and within the bounds of international norms? Until that question could be answered affirmatively, America would fight alone.